are certainly glad to have you this morning. Man, I've never experienced this before. I'm like conflicted. Not even sure what to do this morning. So, first of all, let's get this out of the way, and maybe God will deposit something else as we move along. Easter is in 2 weeks. You got an Easter preview this morning, but I want you to real quickly look around. Everybody look around. And I want you to ask yourself a question. Do we think everyone will fit in here for Easter? Yeah, so that's where you come into play. I won't ask for a raise of hands because you might get embarrassed if I ask this, but if you're planning on inviting someone to come to Easter with you, which I hope you are, let's just go ahead and say we are, right? We are, so that would double our crowd. So the only way we'll be able to contain that is if some of you make the sacrifice of getting up a little early on Easter Sunday to come to our 9:30 service. So please, please, please consider that. You're going to hear about me harp on it next week as well. We really need you to allow yourself to come here a little bit early so that we can spread out the crowd between the two services, and that would be very, very helpful. So also on Easter, we'll have an Easter egg hunt that will happen after the second service. So if you don't hang around, if you're here for the first service, still make sure that you come back at about our normal time that we get done. And we'll have an Easter service for the kids. There will only be kids the second service. So please, those of you who do not have children, allow space for those that do so they can make sure that there is somewhere for their kids to go. Also, that same day will be our Easter dinner. They talked about that a little bit last week. So that's an opportunity for you to not have to have Easter dinner by yourself. We'll have all of that. If you have not signed up yet to participate in that, whether it's serving, cooking, whatever that may be. If you've ever received any type of communication from Collision Church before, it will come from a 614-826-6353 or something like that. That number, you can text that number and let us know that you would like to be involved. It's Easter meal is the key word, and we'll get you involved in that as well. We are in week 5 of this series titled Don't Manipulate Your Promise. But before we do that, God gave me a little bit of a word. I didn't know it was going to be for it this morning, but I went back and looked at my notes, and I'm not even sure where this came from, but I believe maybe it is a good word for somebody in here this morning. Don't mistake your get-tos for your got-tos. What I mean by that is you'll say, well, I've got to do this, and I know that's not proper English, so don't judge me too quickly. But I've got to do this. I've got to do that. Got to do this. No, you get to do those things. I've got to get up and go to work today. No, you get to go up and go to work today. I've got to go do this. No, listen, you get to go do all of those things. And be careful not to mistake your get-tos for your got-tos, because I believe that there's some people maybe in this room today that you've been complaining about circumstances in your life. You've been complaining about some things going on in your life right now that are actually blessings. You just don't realize it. Because you've allowed your perspective to be flipped upside down so much you don't even know what is a blessing and what is a curse. And what you're calling as a curse is actually a blessing, and what is a blessing you're actually calling a curse. So allow yourself to be transformed by that word this morning, because I believe that if you will allow that to happen, then you'll see some amazing things happen. What will change? Your perspective. Listen, perspective is amazing. Two people can look at the same thing and you look at it totally differently, all because of your perspective. All right? We are in week 5 of this series titled Don't Manipulate Your Promise. I'm excited about what God will give to you because I'm not sure exactly what it's going to be. We're going to go through this. I'm going to give you what God gave me, and then I'll give it to you as he gives it to me as we move through this. Last week, we had a bit of a flashback as we went to Genesis chapter 12. We saw how Abraham overshot his promise by making a compromise to go to Egypt when he was supposed to go to Canaan. God told him that when he got to Canaan, this is the land where you and your inhabitants will dwell. But there was a famine in the land, which caused him to overshoot the promise of God and go to a place where he felt like he could sustain himself. Have you ever been there? Overshoot the promise of God because you think you need to do something to sustain yourself. That's exactly the place that Abraham found himself last week as we talked about that. Compromises in our life. That compromise of him going to Egypt led to additional compromises, which delayed the promise of a son through his wife, Sarah. How many realize this morning that it's most often multiple small compromises that lead to the bigger problem? It's not a one-time thing. It's not one big event that got me to where I am. It's a lot of really small compromises that I allowed myself to think, I can handle that compromise. So then I do another compromise, and I think I can handle that one, and I keep having these compromises until eventually I'm waking up like, what just happened? It didn't just happen. It happened through a series of compromises, and that's the same thing we saw in the life of Abram. This week we're going to be in chapter 20. We're going to start there, then we're going to bounce back to chapter 12. So we'll be in Genesis chapter 20. That's where we'll begin today. We'll start reading in verse 1 today. It says this: Now Abraham moved on from there into a region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar. Now, Sodom and Gomorrah, we didn't read about that. That wasn't part of this particular series. But in the couple previous chapters, you'll see about Sodom and Gomorrah. It's just been destroyed. It's been destroyed by the two angels that accompanied Jesus when they visited Sarah and Abraham. It was destroyed because of their sexual perversion and other ungodliness that took place. And the angel came to completely wipe it out and to annihilate it. While Abraham didn't live in Sodom and Gomorrah. He did live on a hill that overlooked Sodom and Gomorrah. And apparently he didn't want to look at the ruins of what was left of that city that he had a tremendous fondness for, because that's where his nephew Lot lived. He didn't want to see that anymore. So he decided that he wanted to move on to somewhere else. And that's where it says he settled for a short time in Gerar. Verse 2, and there Abraham said to his wife, she is my sister. Not to his wife, said of his wife, she is my sister. There Abraham said of his wife, she is my sister. That is a weird verse, right? Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. She is my sister. I need to stop there for just a moment because we need to rewind to go all the way back to chapter 12 again. We need to go back there and see exactly what's going on that helps us understand this verse a little better. Verse 11 of chapter 12 says this: And he was about to enter Egypt. He said to his wife, Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. Doesn't this sound familiar? This happened in chapter 12 as he was about to enter into Egypt, and now he's going to live for some time in a place called Gerar, and he's using the same exact excuse for who Sarah is to him. He's saying she is my sister instead of saying that she is my wife. We have this happening 20 some years later than it happened the first time. He said it in Egypt, now he's saying it in Gerar. Why am I bringing this up to you? Why do I think this is so important? Because it's important for us to realize that what we mess up in one season of our life, if we don't correct that, it's going to come back around in another season of our life. What he was unwilling to surrender to God in that moment is exactly what came back to haunt him again in another season of his life. And if you don't realize this, and maybe you feel like you've been on a merry-go-round and you have to deal with the same thing over and over and over again, it's because you have not learned what God needs you to learn in the season he has you in right now. So he's giving you an opportunity to over and over and over again figure out what you're unwilling to do for yourself. What's causing Abraham to behave this way? What's causing him to not want to admit that Sarah is his wife? He says it's because of the beauty. He gives all kinds of excuses, but I want to share with you today the few things that I think may be causing him to act this way. Number one is fear. Number two is doubt. And number three is insecurity. He had some fear. He was afraid that they would kill him if he kept Sarah as his wife. So instead, he calls her his sister instead of being his wife, because now he feels like somehow that will spare his life. They won't kill him for the sake of his wife, Sarah. Number two, doubt. As far as the second account goes, the one in chapter 20, God has already told him that his son Isaac would come through Sarah. But now he's doubting that promise. If he didn't doubt that promise, he wouldn't be worried about what would happen to him when he went into Gerar and said, "This is my wife." Now, just for a moment, if we can go back, and I spoke to Matt in the back of the church about this because I really didn't put it in my notes, but it's kind of interesting to me because I thought, well, the first time this happened in Egypt, Sarah is 65 years old. And he's worried about how beautiful she looks that someone else might take her. Now listen, I'm not saying you can't be beautiful at 64, 65 years old, but whatever her skincare regimen is, like, can I get some of that, please? All right, so then we fast forward 24 more years and it happens again. She's almost 90 years old and he's still worried about this. Now listen, the reason for that may very well have been, as I did my studies and looked at this, there's a real good possibility that God actually reversed time for Sarah. That instead of allowing her to somehow immaculately conceive a child inside of her, but later on she also had to nurse that child. Instead of doing that, that God actually reversed the clock and maybe put her back in the ages of 40 or 45 years old when she had her son, Isaac. Now, why is that important for us to realize? Because essentially what God did was place her back in the same season that Abraham allowed himself to manipulate her and everyone around her. He gave another opportunity for him to see his wife in the same manner that he saw her in before when he manipulated the promises of God, and God's giving him a do-over chance to do it again. But here he is faced with this dilemma. And maybe it's for one of these reasons that I told you about. Maybe it's his insecurity. Maybe it's insecurity. He didn't believe God was who he said he was. God told him that the promise would come through his wife. He told him the promises, but maybe he's not only doubting it, maybe he's doubting who God really is in his life. God gave it to me this way. What we fail to address and surrender to God right now will come back and reveal itself again in the future. You must be willing to surrender to whatever is holding you back right now. Because if it's one of these three things that I mentioned to you, you can be sure it will come back and haunt you again in another season of your life. If you don't deal with fear in this season, it will come back to you again in a future season. If you don't deal with doubt right now, it's not going to go away on its own. It might for a period of time, but something's going to come into your life that's going to rock your world and it's going to cause you to doubt all over again. Why? Because I never dealt with it in the first place. If you don't address your insecurities right now in the season God has you in, then don't be surprised when you're plagued by insecurity in a future season. What comes around, goes around. If we don't deal with these things that God has brought to your attention in your life right now, don't say, I'll deal with this a different day. Don't say that I'll plan to take care of this at some future time. If God is bringing it to your attention to be dealt with today, don't delay in dealing with it. Because if you push it down, you push it aside, and you act like it's not really a deal, not really a big deal for you. Insecurity is not really a problem for me. It was just about that one thing. Then guess what? That one thing is going to come up again because you have to deal with that one thing. Scripture doesn't tell us that Abraham had ever even been to Egypt before. In fact, we can believe that this was his first visit to Egypt. Why is that important for us to understand this morning? How did he know they would kill him because his wife was beautiful? He didn't even know those people. He had no idea. Why do I say that to you? Because insecurity makes us irrational. I don't know if you realize that or not, but it makes us irrational. It makes us come up with scenarios that may never exist outside of our own insecurities. Insecurity and fear can cause us to live in a place I call hypothetical land. You ever lived in hypothetical land? Hypothetical land is the one that creates the worst case scenario for absolutely everything you're going through. Right? It's the one that says I have a small mole that is surely it's cancer. And it's going to kill me in the next 2 months if I don't get this taken care of. It might, but that's hypothetical land. Right? I don't know what's going to happen, but my irrationality will cause my mind to go to places that God never wanted my mind to go to in the first place because I'm depending on my own ability and my own strength and my own ability to take care of these things that God wants to deal with in my life. Hypothetical land is a very, very dangerous place. It's a dangerous place for us to get to because we start assuming things. We start trying to figure things out that God never wanted us to worry about in the first place. It's the place that causes us to doubt God's plan and His calling for us in our life. We say, well, if I do that, if I step out and do what God wants me to here, I just know this is what's going to happen on the other side of it. No, you don't. You're living in a hypothetical situation. You're trying to figure out what it looks like, but you don't know because you don't have the ability to look into the future to see exactly what God's trying to do with you right now. Abram allowed his insecurity to impact his life some 24 years later. Why? Because he never dealt with it the first time. He never dealt with it the first time. You need to understand this morning, we don't outgrow sin. We don't outgrow sin. It's not something that we'll eventually get over. It's not something that as I get older, that I'll be able to better deal with sin as I get older. What I'm telling you is this, what my relationship with sin has always been this, it's never enough. When I sin, it always wants more of me. I don't outgrow it, it outgrows me. It outgrows my ability and my capacity to deal with it. It's not something that one day I'll decide I don't have to worry about this anymore. It will plague me all the way until the day I die if I don't deal with it now. It won't get easier to deal with tomorrow if I don't take care of it today. I'm not going to decide, you know what, I think it'll be okay today. I'll take care of this tomorrow or the next time it comes around. I just don't have the energy. I don't have the ability to take care of this stuff. There's multiple things that you can tell yourself, but ultimately at the end of the day, you must deal with the sin that is right in front of you in this moment. Too many times we try to manage our sin when we should be trying to eradicate it. It's like we keep sin around like it's a little pet. We try to hang on to it. Maybe if I groom it just right, it will act like I want it to. Listen, it's not a dog. It's not something that you can train. It's not something that you can potty train to let it outside and once in a while it might have an accident back on the inside. What I'm telling you is sin is not a pet. It's dangerous. It's like a lion that is seeking to destroy you. To destroy you, and it just continues to grow bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually it takes me out. But listen, we have the solution to sin. His name is Jesus Christ. But the longer you take to introduce Jesus to your situation, the greater opportunity you're giving sin to give a bigger grip on your life. You're allowing sin to displace God in your life. You're allowing it to choke out the relationship that you have with God because it's growing larger and larger and larger, and you're acting like it's no big deal. It is a big deal. It's a huge deal. Everyone else can see it. You just can't see it. You've become so blinded by sin that you won't allow yourself to see what it really is. It is wreaking havoc on your life, and it is destroying you from the inside out. Ooh, that is not popular preaching. So, preacher, are you saying that my fear, doubt, and insecurities are all sins? I'm not. The Bible does. Romans 14:23 says that everything that does not come from faith is a sin. Everything that does not come from faith is a sin. So let me play those back over again. Does fear come from faith? Like 4 of you are willing to say it. The rest of you are like, I'm not falling for that trap. What I'm saying to you this morning, if it doesn't come from faith, the Bible says it is sin. Listen, when I'm fearful, we're not talking about a fear of God. That's a respect thing. This is totally different. This is when some things happen in my life and I become fearful about what's going to happen, what I'll wear tomorrow, what I'll eat tomorrow, all of those things that the Bible says that the people of the earth deal with. See, when I become fearful of those things, I am displacing God's provision in my life. I am leaning on my own understanding in those moments. And what I'm telling you today is that I've heard people say before, listen, you can't say that faith and fear can't coexist. They do. Listen, what I'm telling you is the Bible tells us that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but He's given us a spirit of hope and love and of a sound mind. If you're dealing with fear in your life, it's because your faith is not strong enough. It hasn't grown enough to the development that you need to see it grow in your life. What about doubt? What about doubt? Does doubt come from faith? I'm not saying I can't doubt that God will do exactly what he said he would do, but that is an indicator of a lack of faith in my life. Listen, I know it's difficult. It's difficult to say that if I step out on nothing, that God will catch me and he'll carry me. It's difficult, but when I doubt that he will do it, I bring everything back into my own abilities and I try to put my hands back on it, and I try to put my hands back on what God has been trying to rip away from me for most of my life. Listen, doubt and fear are both a sign of a different thing, which is actually your control. It's your control. What you're really saying is I can't control this outcome, so now I'm afraid of it, and I doubt God will take care of this. How about this last one of insecurity? Insecurity is something that wreaks havoc on a lot of us. It's what impacts our relationships with one another. It's what causes me to think terribly of myself. It's what causes me to think everyone else is judging me, all because of some insecurities that I have in my life. But again, Romans 14:23 says that everything that does not come from faith is a sin. Now, there are a couple things that stuck out to me when I was reading through this story. I don't know if this happens to you or not, but sometimes there are some verses or some words inside of a verse that feel like they just jump out at me. And I have to look at it and see, what is the context of this? Why is this speaking to my heart so much? And one of the things that came out of that was, Abram was willing to lose his wife, but not his life. He was willing to lose his wife. She even got married to Pharaoh. We find that as we read through this. He was willing to give her away so he could save himself. In other words, he was willing to see others get hurt in order to preserve himself. Listen, I don't know if that's speaking to anybody today, and don't nudge your neighbor if it's speaking to them. This is to you right now. Sometimes we are willing to step on whomever we need to step on because I'm only looking out for me, myself, and I. I'm willing to hurt whomever I need to hurt. Why? Because my insecurities are raging inside of me, so I'm willing to hurt and step on anyone I need to get what I think I need in this life. That's not what the Bible tells us. As a matter of fact, it tells us, Paul tells us in Philippians 2:3, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. Too many times we make decisions without regard to the impact it will have on those around us. We just do it because it feels right. You ever said that? You ever heard someone say that? It just feels right to do this. Listen, it never feels right to put someone else down. It never feels right to step on someone else to get an advancement in a world that's all going to pass away anyway. It never feels right to do that. You have validated it inside yourself. You have rationalized that behavior in and of yourself. Look at that. Look at that again. It says, rather in humility, value others above yourselves. Now, that doesn't mean that we allow ourselves to be taken advantage of by others. That's not what that verse says. Some of us are so depleted because we allow everyone else to take from us. We have nothing left to give even to ourselves or God. We allow ourselves to be ripped away by other people because it's an attempt for us to somehow fix in them what we don't see we can fix inside of ourselves. What we're deficient of, we want to find a way to fix that in someone else. So we find ourselves in that scenario. So it's not that we're allowing ourselves to be depleted. That's not what that verse says. It does mean that we should make sure that our selfishness is not hurting other people. Make sure my selfishness is not hurting other people. Listen, is it okay to be selfish? Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is. When it's in a matter of recovery, it's important that I understand I can be selfish in this moment. I can be selfish because if I don't take care of what's ailing me, no one else is going to be any good to me, and I'm not going to be any good to anyone else. So in some seasons, I must be selfish. But watch this. When I'm being selfish for a good reason like that, it's not hurting anyone else. It's not hurting anyone else. When I'm being selfish because I'm trying to fix what's broken inside of me, it's not at the expense of anyone else. It might be at the expense of their feelings because I'm not living up to the expectation that they have for me, but it's really not hurting them deep down because I need to fix me. I need to work on what's broken inside of me. I need to be selfish for just a moment. This might hurt you in the meantime, but in the long run, it's going to be exactly what both of us need. Woo! I don't know who that was for. The second thing that stuck out to me as odd as this, look at verse 11. And as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. Notice that it says, as he was about to enter Egypt. That means he already had a preconceived plan on how he was going to deal with it once he got there. Listen, he had already premeditated how he was going to handle himself when he got there. He had already decided in and of himself how he was going to handle a situation that didn't even exist to the best of his knowledge. He was living in a hypothetical, but he had already created a scenario for the hypothetical situation he may or may not even get into. Have you ever done that before? Listen, I just know Bob's going to be there. And if Bob's there, Bob doesn't like me and I don't like Bob. So I'm going to create this whole scenario. By the time I get there, I'm just going to go right up and punch Bob right in the face because we're going to get this thing over with. Bob doesn't even know who you are. And he really doesn't even care about you. Listen, we do this all the time. We create scenarios because we like to feel overwhelmed. How many realize that this morning? We like to feel overwhelmed. We like to feel overwhelmed because then we feel like somehow we have some power to control being overwhelmed. We like to feel it because now somehow I can control how I will handle feeling overwhelmed. And we put ourselves in a position to feel overwhelmed so that somehow we think we can manage the pain of feeling overwhelmed. He created this entire scenario. He created it. It says, as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife, pretend you are my sister. Preconceived. Now listen, I gave you 3 reasons that may have explained Abram's behavior. Fear, doubt, and insecurity. But I want to give you the one that I believe is actually the real reason. See, sometimes we get anxiety because we fear the outcome of a situation. But other times, we mistake anxiety for conviction. We say it's anxiety. This situation has me anxious. I'm not sure if I should do this or not. I have a lot of anxiety when it comes to this particular situation. No, you have a lot of conviction about what's happening in this area of your life. Should I date this girl or should I not date this girl? I think I should date this girl. Everything in me wants to date this girl, but I'm not sure if I should date this girl. Listen, God gave it to me like this one in the last service. If you have to make excuses for your decisions, it's not the right decision. Listen, when God calls you to a place, there's no excuses that need to be made. No excuses that need to be made. But when I call myself somewhere, I have to make excuses to rationalize my behavior so it makes sense to everyone else I come in contact with. Woo! Abram knew he wasn't supposed to go to Egypt, but he went anyway. Now he's feeling conviction because he knows in his hypothetical land that something may happen there, because he's feeling conviction that he's calling anxiety because there's all kinds of insecurities and doubt and fear that are overwhelming him in this moment. Have you ever had that feeling in your gut that you're about to make a decision that's not in your best interest and you do it anyway? How about this one? You ever pushed through the conviction of sin? Yes. Oh, thanks, Will. You're the only real person in here today. You say, well, Pastor, I don't even know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Let me say it again. You ever pushed through the conviction of sin? You knew it was wrong, but you wanted to do it so badly you did it anyway? You knew you shouldn't do it. You felt it deep inside your soul. God was trying to stop it. He put every obstacle in the way, but you just kept hurtling over top of them like you were in the Olympics to get yourself to the place where you could do exactly what you wanted to do in the first place. You have allowed yourself to continue to push through the conviction, continue to push through the pain, where God's so desperately trying not to get you to do something and you do it anyway because we are sinful in nature. We are bent toward wickedness. We want to do what we want to do, and we don't want anyone to tell us what we should not do. We like it our way. Even if it's wrong for us, we still want to do it. Why? Because we want to control it. Listen, I don't know who this whole control thing is for today, but you are trying to control situations and scenarios in your life that God is trying to get away from you today. Woo! He knew he wasn't supposed to be there, but watch this. He was too prideful to turn back. He could have stopped any moment before he got to Egypt. The lie never had to happen. Hagar never had to happen. Ishmael never had to happen. All of these things didn't have to happen, but he was too prideful to turn around and go back. Why? Probably because he decided he had traveled too far. I've gone 500 and some miles. I need food. I'm going to keep pushing through this. Listen, it doesn't matter how far you have moved on. If you've overshot the promise, it's a perfect time for you to stop, turn around, and go back to the place that God has for you. It doesn't matter if you're 2 steps away from the promised land or if you're 500 miles away. God allows U-turns. He wants you to turn around at any moment and realize that you are powerless over what you're trying to accomplish and put your trust in Him. Too prideful to turn back. That's good for someone today. You know you're headed on the wrong path. You know you're headed in the wrong direction. You know you're making compromises. Don't be too prideful to turn around this morning. Conviction for being where God never called you to will lead you to the other possible reasons he acted irrationally. Because he was in the wrong place. Because he was in the wrong place is what caused him to feel all of these other emotions that he's dealing with. These are all symptoms of the real problem. The real problem is disobedience. Listen, I don't know what you're experiencing in your life right now that you are calling anxiety, worry, doubt, fear. Let's just call it what it is. The reason why you're feeling those emotions is because you're living in disobedience. God has told you what you're supposed to be doing. He has laid it out clearly in front of you, but you just decide you want to do it the way you want to do it. And now what you're feeling is not all of these ranges of emotion. You're feeling conviction because you're outside of God's purposes for you in your life. Verse 14, and sure enough, when Abram arrived in Egypt, everyone noticed Sarai's beauty. When the palace officials saw her, they sang her praises to Pharaoh their king, and Sarai was taken into his palace. Then Pharaoh gave Abram many gifts because of her: sheep, goats, cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. Sounds like a pretty good trade-off. No. Verse 17, but the Lord sent terrible plagues on Pharaoh and his household because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh summoned Abram and accused him sharply. What have you done to me? He demanded. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister and allow me to take her as my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and get out of here. Pharaoh ordered some of his men to escort them, and he sent Abram out of the country along with his wife and all his possessions. Abram's disobedience had a ripple effect on others. It had a ripple effect all the way up to Pharaoh. The Lord sent plagues because of Abram's manipulation. All because of his manipulation. It went all the way. Listen, I don't know who needs to hear that today, but your disobedience is causing ripple effects to those you come in contact with. You being out of God's will, you living life your way, you continuing to live and walk in sin even though God is trying to get you to turn from it, is having a ripple effect that may go generations after you simply because you're unwilling to address today what may come back to you again later. There is a ripple effect for sin. I don't know if you realize that or not. Maybe you think, oh, it's just me. It's just me. It's just a secret sin. No one even knows about this. Listen, it has a ripple effect that you don't even realize is taking place. When an earthquake happens, guess what happens miles and miles away? There's some tremors. They weren't part of the earthquake, but those that were far outside, miles and miles away, got to feel the effects of it. Listen, the same thing happens with our sinful behavior and lifestyles. It may not look like it's causing damage right now, but the ripple effect that may come weeks, months, years in advance, decades in advance, or decades in the future will be something that can be felt by others in future generations. I know what you might be thinking as we read through that, but Marcus says Pharaoh gave Abram many gifts because of Sarai. Actually, doesn't that mean that he got blessed because of his disobedience? Listen, God didn't bless Abram because of his disobedience. He blessed him in spite of his disobedience. He blessed him in spite of his disobedience. Aren't you glad this morning that God didn't give you what you really deserved? Because of his great love for us, God didn't give you exactly what you deserve. What did Moses deserve? Moses deserved death. The very thing he feared in the first place is what he deserved. And listen, pharaohs weren't known for their generosity back in the day. He should have died for what he did. And they would have taken Sarah anyway as his wife. But why didn't he do that? Because God saw ahead of time, and he sent plagues that were so devastating to Pharaoh that he would have no choice but to let her go. Listen, why did he do that? Because the promise was going to come through Abraham and Sarah. It didn't matter what they did. Eventually, it was going to happen. And God stopped it. Stopped them from trying to manipulate it too far that promise could never take place again. God told me to tell you, though, you will take some good lessons out of your disobedience. I don't know if you realize that or not. You'll take some lessons out. It won't be the best lessons. They'll be hard. It'll be difficult. Why? Because our sin always has consequences. Listen, you need to tell the devil that the next time he tries to tempt you to do something. No, there will be consequences. Because he's going to tell you there's not. There won't be any consequences if you eat of this fruit, Eve. You'll be fine. You'll just be like God, knowing what's right from wrong. No. The consequences are always hidden in the fine print of the contract that the devil has you sign to sin. They're always there. The fact of the matter is, it's just like for most of us, anytime we are signing legal documents, they just tell us to sign here, and we do without reading it. Or they do it this way. They cover it up with the elbow and say, hey, just sign right here. That's what the devil's doing to you in your life. You are making compromise after compromise after compromise in your life. Why? Because he's feeding you lies about how great this will be, when in the end, his goal for you is destruction, death. He wants to take you out. The devil is not your friend. What you struggle with is not your friend. It wants to steal from you, it wants to kill you, and it wants to destroy everything in your life. Let's look back at chapter 20, verse 3. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, you are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman. Now Abimelech had not gone near her. So he said, Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Did not he say to me, she is my sister? And didn't she also say, he is my brother? I have done this in a clear conscience and clear hands. Then God said to him in a dream, yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience. So I have kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not return her, you may be sure that you and all who belong to you will die. Early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all his officials, and when he told them all that had happened, they were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said, what have you done to us? How have I wronged you, that you have brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You have done this to me that should never be done. And Abimelech asked Abraham, what was your reason for doing this? Watch his response. Abraham replied, I said to myself, I lived in hypothetical land. I made this decision before I knew the facts. There is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Oh, by the way, I think I forgot to mention something to you. Gerar was on the border of Canaan, just outside the land of promise. What happened last week? Abram overshot the promise. What happened 24 years later? Abraham overshot the promise. He was now living in a land God did not tell him to live in. And he stayed there. There's that stink bug again. My goodness. Can't make that stuff up. Coming for the promise. It's not found in me. What I'm saying to you this morning is that 24 years earlier, he overshot the promise and lived in Egypt, in a land he never should have been in, and now he's doing it again. He's living back in a place. Listen, the whole reason why he had to create and concoct this whole story again is because he is once again living in a land God never told him to go to. He's still living in a territory that God never told him to go to. Listen, and whenever we get ourselves out of God's will and we live in a territory God never called us to, then we will always be in hypothetical situations creating excuses for why we're doing what we're doing. I shared with you before, as long as we're living where God has us, we have no need of an excuse. But when we're living in territories God never called us to, then we'll create scenarios and excuses for why we were there in the first place. Abraham has lost his faith in the promise. Why? Because he's manipulating it. He's manipulating the promise. God told him his descendants and him would live in the land of Canaan, and now he is living outside of the land of Canaan. What was the promise? The promise was that God would make of him a great nation. He told him that his descendants would be like the stars of the sky. Unable to count them, it would be so many. Let me ask an obvious and very sarcastic question. How was God going to fulfill that promise if Abram was dead? God gave him a promise. Your descendants will be like the stars of the sky. Yet he's living in a hypothetical situation that says they are going to kill me. How then is God's promise going to be activated in the life of Abram if he's dead? But listen, again, it makes us irrational. It makes us do things we never would do when we're walking closely with God because he's living in disobedience. He's living in disobedience. Verse 12. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother. And she became my wife. I'm just going to leave that right there. Not going to elaborate on that. It's pretty easy to see. Pretty gross. But watch verse 13. And when God had me wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother. Pay particular attention to those words that say, and when God had me wander from my father's household. This word wander has a very negative connotation with it. In fact, in my studies, I saw it's used 50 times in the Bible, and it's never for a positive reason. In fact, the theologian Donald Barnhouse said of this word, it is used of animals going astray, of a drunken man reeling or staggering, of sinful seduction, of a prophet's lies causing people to err, of the path of a lying heart. 6 other words are translated wander, any one of which Abraham might have used, but he used the worst word available. Why? The way in which Abraham used this word is almost like he's blaming God for making him leave his father's household in the first place. In other words, what he's saying is if God had never made me leave my father's house, I never would have been in Gerar in the first place. Listen, how many of you realize this morning that when we begin to live in disobedience, if we're not real careful, we'll start to blame God for it. We'll start to blame God that he ever called us out in the first place. If I had never gotten saved in the first place, God, none of this stuff ever would have happened to me. Listen, that's not the point of all of this. God called him to a promise. It wasn't because he was walking in God's will that got him in trouble. It's because he was walking in disobedience. And disobedience is not God's fault. You can blame whomever you want to, but guess what? The only one that is responsible for your disobedience is you. Say it. It's me. It's me. I'm the one responsible for my disobedience. It's not anyone else's fault. They didn't make me do it. I chose to do it. I'm the one who is being disobedient. So what do we see here? We see 24 years later, and Abraham is still not taking responsibility for his sin. He's still walking in disobedience, not taking responsibility for his sin. This isn't God's fault. God didn't make him go to Gerar. This is a consequence of his sin by living in a place that God never told him to go in the first place. Listen, I've talked about this already, but I want to make sure I shoot this straight all the way to the point. There are consequences to your sin. And those consequences are not God's fault. What you do and the consequences to your sin are not God's fault. They are simply a consequence to what you did that was wrong in the first place. As the band comes this morning, I want to ask you a question. I know you may be feeling a lot of emotions right now. A lot of things may be going on in your life. You have some anxiety, you have some worry, you have some doubt, you have some fear, you have some insecurities. All of these things are reeling inside of you. What I really want to ask you this morning, though, is this. Are you anxious or are you being convicted? Are you anxious? Is there certain circumstances or feelings or emotions that you're feeling right now that are causing you to feel overwhelmed? And are they legitimate, or is this really just conviction for what God's doing in your life? Is he convicting you of some sinful behavior in your life? You're calling it a range of emotions, but let's be honest, it's really just disobedience. It's disobedience. It has nothing to do with the emotion itself. That's just a symptom of the real problem. The real problem is not anxiety. The real problem is not doubt. The real problem is not worry. The real problem is disobedience. And I believe this was for someone today. Someone's living in a land of disobedience. And maybe you're even blaming God for what's happening in your life right now. But listen, you would never have the circumstances. You would never have what's happening to you right now as a consequence if you weren't living in a land God never called you to. We see this now twice. He didn't learn his lesson the first time. He ended up back in another territory, but watch this time. Last time it was 524 miles, I think, away. This time, it was right on the border. It was almost like, if I stay close enough to the promise, maybe I'll be okay. If I just keep part of myself near the promise, I'll be okay. Listen, it doesn't matter whether you're a couple of steps away from obedience or you're on the whole other side of the world, obedience. You're still being disobedient to God. And I believe your disobedience is causing some consequences in your life that you're blaming God for. You're blaming on your emotions. You're blaming it on doubt. You're blaming it on an old relationship. You're blaming it on a whole lot of things, when in all actuality, none of those things would have existed if you hadn't gone to a land you were never supposed to go to in the first place. A land God never called you to. He's called you to a place of promise. He's called you to abide in his will. But you've decided for whatever reason that you're smarter than God. And listen, I don't say that from a condescending way. I do it all the time. I think God should take some advice from me sometimes. I know better what to do for my life than he does. No, I don't. And you don't either. Why? Because all we can see is our current circumstances while God sees the whole picture. I also believe that some people are dealing with some things in your life right now that if you don't take care of these, if you don't get to the real root of the problem, you're going to see these things coming back again in another season of your life. And it can all be traced back to disobedience. I call that willful disobedience. To know to do good and to not do it, James says, is a sin. The end of James chapter 4 says to know to do good and to not do it is a sin. You've been living in willful disobedience. You've been walking outside of the protection that God has for your life. All the while blaming Him for what you're going through, or blaming someone else. Will you come back and settle in the land God has for you this morning? He allows U-turns. He allows you to leave your disobedience and turn back to Him in a life of obedience. It's our opportunity. It's our opportunity to turn back to God. To dismiss our lifestyle. Dismiss our wickedness and our disobedience and come back to Him. I want to pray with you this morning. I want you to be honest with God with heads bowed and eyes closed. No one moving around, please. I want this to be an honest moment. I know I just said heads bowed, but keep your eyes closed. I don't want you to lift your hands this morning. People might feel that. I just want you to put your head toward the ceiling. If you're here this morning and you realize that you're living in some disobedience in your life, it's having some consequences in your life. No one looking around. This is just between you and God right now. I'm not even looking. I've got my head up too. I want you to talk to God about it today. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you care enough to leave us like we are. God, you are calling us to a life of obedience. But I just still want to be disobedient. Inside my sinful nature, I want to do what I want to do. And God, because of that, I've caused myself a great deal of pain. The consequences are heavy. I've been blaming emotions. I've been blaming people. But all the while, God, it's really just been me living in disobedience to you. So God, we come to you today, our heads held high, not out of pride, but out of surrender. Looking up to the King, not looking down. We come to you today not in shame. We come to you in humility, asking that you will forgive us again for what we have done to be disobedient to you. God, I don't want to have to keep replaying scenarios and events in my life because I can't get it right. I want to deal with these now so I don't have to deal with it later. And so my children don't have to deal with it. And so my grandchildren don't have to deal with it. And my great-great-grandchildren don't have to deal with it. Because, God, the ripple effect of sin is catastrophic. God, let it stop with me. Let it stop with us. May I be willing this morning, God, to call it disobedience, to call it what it is, and surrender that to you, and walk in surrender to you this morning, in obedience to the King, living where you want me to go. God, will I mess up? Absolutely. But God, give me the conviction to know that when I'm about to mess up, I shouldn't. Give me the wisdom and discernment to know what's right for me and what's wrong for me. And give me the strength to choose what's right. I ask this in the name of Jesus. As we stand to our feet this morning, I want to give you an opportunity to reflect on that. Ask yourself the question, is it anxiety? Is it doubt? Is it fear? Or is it conviction this morning? What am I feeling? What's going on in my life? As we get ready to sing this morning, I want you to just reflect on that today.